Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be discussing the potential return of a classic Eldar archetype. And of course, I am talking about Mechdar. Eldar aspect warriors and other units mounted up in wave serpents and falcons and delivered into the heart of the enemy positions. Now, I did a video of this in the very beginning of the edition as an alternative and fun way to run the Eldar in comparison to, of course, the Wraith Knight spam that existed at the time. And I actually ran this list quite a few times myself and had a lot of fun with it, and it was very powerful. And it was very powerful because despite the negative feedback that the Wave Serpent received upon the index release, I actually thought it was pretty good. Did its job very well, and of course at the time we were working with more fate dice that you could use essentially infinitely, so the 5+ invul save came in handy big time. Also, because of the way the Serpent shield worked back then, you could use it at any time, essentially making sure that enemy units that failed their battle shock stayed battle shocked. However, a lot of us knew that this was probably just another rules oversight and essentially typo in the way GW wrote a lot of their rules incorrectly at the beginning of the edition, so not a lot of us expected this to stick around. So when it did eventually get fixed, that was enough for a lot of players to pretty much just write off the Wave Serpent wholesale. And of course, with things like the Yinkarn and Wraithguard and, Falcons with Fire Dragons pretty much dominating competitive play, we really didn't see much room for the humble Wave Serpent in those types of lists. However, since the balanced data slate has beaten down quite a few of our competitive units, our objective holding units like Wraithguard, we've had a much harder time being able to secure primary objectives and also just protect our fragile aspect warriors. And there is a slow but subtle change in the meta that a lot of people haven't quite realized yet, but that is the emergence of several armies now which have access to a 3-inch deep strike, including the Necron Menace via the Hypercrypt Legion, and now the new Tau Codex, as well with their Battlesuit Detachment. And of course, as we all know, Crisis Suits do hit very hard and will clean up aspect warriors no problem. And that has basically necessitated either one or two things. The inclusion of more screening units to make sure that those, 3-inch deep strikers can't get into good positions to kill your units, or quite simply more protection via things like Falcons and of course, Wave Serpents. And while often most players will just go with the Falcon, I think there is an argument to be made that including a couple Wave Serpents in your list, if used correctly, might not actually be a bad idea. And in some cases, might actually be a better option than the Falcon itself. So before we get into the video, let's go ahead and talk about what we're going to be looking at today. So first of all, we are going to be reviewing the stats, weapons, and special rules of the Wave Serpent. We're going to be looking at its strengths and weaknesses, its combos and synergies, the insane tricks you can pull off with the Wave Serpent, and lastly, the role of the Wave Serpent in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of it. So looking at the profile of the Wave Serpent, it has a 14-inch movement just like most Eldar grab tanks. It also does have the benefit of having an extra wound, which is cool. Has 13 wounds instead of 12. Probably won't matter in that many scenarios, but, in a couple of games here and there, I have had a Wave Serpent survive on 1 wound and force my opponent to use something else to kill it. It also comes with a 5+ invulnerable save, which actually does do something with the Wave Serpent. Because the Wave Serpent has a 3+ save, and, there's a lot of stuff out there like Melta weapons that are especially effective against the toughness 9 hull of the Wave Serpent, a 5+ invul does actually come in handy a lot. And especially when you're moving it out into the open, you don't have cover, it is going to be effective against las cannons and AP3 weapons as well. So it is a little bit tougher than our regular grab tanks. Not too much tougher, but just tough enough to maybe sustain one more direct hit. As far as its ranged weapons go, it can take a shuriken cannon underslung, which is effective against mech targets. It can also take a twin Eldar missile launcher, which does decent damage against large targets and light infantry, but is outclassed by the Bright Lance in both anti-large and the Scatter Laser in anti-horde. Speaking of, it can also, of course, take the Twin Bright Lance, which is the best anti-large weapon available, and the default pick for the current meta, because there's so many large targets out there that need to be destroyed. It can take a Twin Shuriken Cannon, which is effective against mech targets, and combos well with the Underslung Shuriken Cannon. This is my personal favorite loadout because of the way I use the Wave Serpent, but, in most cases, people are going to be taking the Bright Lance. And of course, the Twin Scouter Laser is effective against light infantry, but is probably the least valuable of all the weapons. If you don't want to go with the Underslung Shuriken Cannon, it can take a Shuriken Catapult. This is a consideration for the Wave Serpent because you are going to, of course, be probably trying to score secondary objectives with this later on in the game. It's just in my experience, I always like the Shuriken Cannon for that little bit of extra damage. And lastly, you could take the Twin Star Cannon, which is pretty effective against mech targets, but less general purpose than the Shuriken Cannon itself. As far as its melee weapons go, it's armed with the Wraithbone Hull, just like all Eldar grab tanks, which is pretty good for tank shock. Being able to have strength 6 means you're going to get a good number of dice against most infantry targets. As far as its abilities go, a lot of people discount this ability and, kind of write it off as a trash ability, but I actually think it's pretty good for getting around a couple things. So it does cause D3 mortals to a target within 12, and it also forces a battle shock test once per game in the beginning of the shooting phase. Now, the reason why this is actually better than some of the other battle shock effects that, things like the Wraithseer or things like the Void Weaver have, is because those units require you to actually target an enemy unit with a range attack, which will, ipso facto, allow your opponent to use stratagems on that unit preemptively. That means if you're trying to prevent an Armor of Contempt stratagem from being used on a very tough unit, unfortunately that's not going to work because your opponent can just simply use that before the battle shock even takes place, and that will still come into effect even if they do fail it. And yes, maybe it'll prevent smoke or maybe, double stratagems and stuff like that opponents can layer upon a certain vehicle or tough target. But, it's going to be less effective than this because this can be used in the beginning of the shooting phase. And of course, it's not a ranged attack, which means that, your opponent is not going to be able to target that unit with Armor of Contempt or smoke or anything like that. So if they fail that battle shock, that means that unit cannot be targeted by future stratagems, and this really cuts the durability of that unit. However, just a disclaimer, you do have to fail that battle shock test. The good news about it is that your opponent is not going to be able to really, unless they want to use their once per game insane bravery stratagem, they're not really going to be able to stop it, which is a positive. And again, it also does D3 mortal wounds, so you're doing some damage as well. Really good for, getting those last couple of wounds on a hard target. And mortals are always good because they get past a lot of the defensive buffs that your opponent might have. As far as its war gear options, it can pretty much take a twin-linked version of any Eldar heavy weapon. It can also take a Shuriken Cannon. I personally don't like the new twin-linked rule on a lot of vehicles, but, we've had this before. The Wave Serpent historically has, had a twin-linked turret. So it just means you're going to be a little bit less efficient with your Eldar rerolls, but you still have 2 heavy weapons, which is nothing to scoff at. As far as its transport capacity, this is one of the main reasons you take it. It does have a large transport capacity. It can carry 2 units of 5 aspect warriors with characters, or a big unit. It could even carry a unit of wraiths, which we're going to talk about later in this video. As far as its point cost, this is where a lot of people, again, are turned off by it a little bit because it does seem a little bit expensive when compared with other transports of other factions, right? For a Rhino, you're paying roughly 75 points. That's a lot less than this vehicle. And a lot of people have said that, you're paying a high tax for the fly special rule with this model, which is absolutely true. I think the fact that you can't easily move over ruins anymore is a big downside. But specifically with the Wave Serpent, it's not that big of a deal because mostly you're going to be, more aggressive. You're going to be wanting to move over enemy units and not necessarily over ruins and things like that. And typically it is fast enough to get where you want to go in the mid-board. And it's even fast enough to move into positions to be, kind of out of line of sight in the middle ground early on in the game. And for 120 points, I actually think you get a good amount of stuff. I know it doesn't seem like it, But the Wave Serpent can do some pretty kind of cool tricks early on in the game, and it's cheaper than the Falcon, and it's also, of course, more durable than our other grav tanks. And what I like to do is I actually like to compare it to something like the Raider, right? The Raider is a Dark Eldar transport. It's 80 points. It's probably at a pretty good point level right now with the Dark Eldar. It recently got reduced in cost. But when you compare this thing to a Raider, it actually, kind of compares pretty favorably. You get a 5+ invul save instead of a normal 6+ invul save that the Raider gets. You're getting a higher toughness value. You're getting more wounds. You're getting, of course, a better armor save. You're getting a slightly higher transport capacity, which may not seem like a lot, but, being able to fit an extra character in there, like a Hondres or something like that, or a Solitaire perhaps, is kind of cool. And lastly, you get extra weapons, right? You do get to take that shuriken cannon, which may not seem like a lot, but it is a powerful weapon, especially when you're considering comparing it to other transports, which don't typically have a lot of ranged options. Things like the Devilfish, of course, have, less powerful ranged weapons. Rhinos have almost no ranged weapons. So you are getting a fair bit more for the, 50% higher cost that the Wave Serpent on average will cost you over those other transports. And also the ability that the Wave Serpent has isn't that bad, right? I mean, you could do a lot worse. The Raider's ability, for example, isn't that great. It's pretty mediocre at best. Being able to advance 6 inches is decent, but when you can't shoot with the unit inside of it, it starts to be a problem. And especially with all the tough units that we're seeing now that are very stratagem dependent, I think having an ability that can potentially, stop an opponent from using stratagems on their very tough unit could be game changing. As far as its keywords go, it does have the fly and vehicle keywords, which can make it awkward to maneuver, especially because the Wave Serpent is actually slightly larger than our other transports with the fins that are on it. But, I found that on most terrain setups, this isn't really a big deal. It doesn't hamper it too much. And in some cases, it can actually help you because it gives your vehicle a little bit more of a footprint for move blocking and stuff like that. So what are this thing's strengths and weaknesses, the classic Wave Serpent? So its strengths are, it is very fast with a large transport capacity. It does have an increased durability with a 5+ invul and an extra wound, which does sometimes make a difference. It also deals mortal wounds once per game and can force battle shock, which is very important in the meta. The weaknesses are, however, it can be difficult to maneuver. Its shooting is on the weaker side, although, like I said, it is very comparable to other transports for the cost. And it is still fragile for the points, but hey, we can expect that because, of course, we play a very high skill cap faction, and we do need to be careful with our models because they are on the fragile side. Its combos and synergies, though, are where it kind of gets a little bit interesting because its ability to do mortal wounds and battle shock combined with tank shock can cause some serious mortal wound damage that your opponent might not be able to do anything against because they'll be battle shocked for the rest of the turn. So if you're going up against a unit that has an ability that allows it to, be targeted by a stratagem or whatever, that allows it to move out of range or do anything like that, the Wave Serpent can just simply shut it down, and not only that, but potentially wipe out the unit with mortal wounds. It's not super likely, but on average, you're going to score about 5 mortal wounds with this thing on an enemy infantry unit, and that's half of the unit dead, right? If you figure a unit of Marines has 10 wounds, you deal 5 of those of mortals, that's half dead right there, and it doesn't seem like much, but again, that's only from a tank shock and its ability. Furthermore, you are going to be doing more damage with its shuriken cannon and bright lance or, twin shuriken cannon, whichever one you decide to pick. Now, what's also interesting about this thing, and I've been doing some number crunching, comparing Dire Avengers to Corsair Void Reavers. I know a lot of you out there think Void Reavers are trash, but they're actually not bad, especially in the early trading, stage of the game. They can actually trade better with enemy Marines and Terminators on objectives than Dire Avengers can. I know that's not saying a lot because the Dire Avenger, kind of damage is a little bit on the weaker side without Overwatch. But Corsairs can very well pop a few Terminators in the opening turns of the game, and when they're in a Wave Serpent especially, they confer Scout 7 upon the Wave Serpent. So the Wave Serpent can actually, kind of be more aggressive with movement or be more defensive with movement, depending on whether or not you go first or second. It is an absolutely super powerful special rule to have in your back pocket, especially when you combine it with the fact that other units in your army are going to have Scout 2, things like Warwalkers, or even things like Shroud Runners as well, right? Warwalkers have a 9-inch Scout move, Shroud Runners have a 9-inch Scout move. Those are both units you are going to see in competitive lists. So if you combine that with, another unit that can Scout, that's a lot of units that can either play up the field very aggressively to get in better positions or play more defensively and at the same time mess with your opponent's deployment. And I'm going to say this again. If you guys, anybody out there listening to this, is looking for a very mid-tier, semi-competitive army that can scrap at the local game store really well and win games, but isn't so OP that your buddies are going to, have a bad time playing against it like some of the other meta Eldar lists, a Corsair-themed army with Wave Serpents and Falcons and things like that is an awesome thing to build. And again, yeah, it might be a little bit expensive to go all into Corsairs, but I do have a video covering a Corsair kind of style army using Wave Serpents. I've actually run it in several games early on in the edition. Not only was it really fun, but it was surprisingly effective, especially at pulling mind games on your opponent. And oh man, if you throw Prince Riel in there as well, it's just an absolute blast and mindfuck to play. You should really consider it. For anybody out there thinking of, running a bunch of Corsairs, definitely think of doing it. Corsair Void Reavers in Wave Serpents is awesome. And lastly, it does benefit from Guide, Doom, and Fortune, although none of them are particularly useful. Maybe Fortune if you don't have a better target, but, there's usually going to be better targets in your army for those abilities. Okay, so in the beginning of the video, I told you guys that I would share with you some, insane strategies that you could pull off with Wave Serpents in your games. So there are 3 things that I love doing with Wave Serpents that really throw a wrench into my opponent's plans. And I like to call those the following: the drop-off, aggressive protection, and Serpent of Fury. So some of these might be kind of familiar because the Tau, for example, have used the quote-unquote Fisher Fury for a long time. But, ours works exactly the same way, just better because we're a superior species. And also, if you guys have any other nice little tricks that you guys like to use the Wave Serpent for, definitely share them in the comment section below. I would love to learn how the community uses the best tried and true Eldar transport. Okay, so like always, we are going to just be using Terrain Layout 1 to show these examples. And by the way, if you guys want me to show you different kind of terrain layouts, let me know, or shoot me an email. And, if you want a specific terrain layout, maybe in WTC or something like that, that you want me to provide in the next video, yeah, definitely shoot me an email of that PDF, and I'll be sure to put it on my next video. But of course, the awesome news is with the Wave Serpent, this pretty much works in any kind of terrain layout because the Wave Serpent is just small enough to kind of fit through ruins and stuff like that, at least go around them for WTC and other terrain setups. So you shouldn't have too much trouble pulling off these same tactics with those different terrain layouts. So the first maneuver we need to talk about is the drop-off. This is the most common form of using the Wave Serpent, right? When you drop off an enemy unit on an objective and you use the Wave Serpent to go after something else or score on an important secondary objective or maybe even move block an opponent. So in this particular setup, we are going to set up on the left-hand side of the battlefield. We are going to drop off our unit right off the bat within 3 inches of the Serpent. That unit is going to move and advance behind that wall so they're out of line of sight to the enemy units that are going to possibly shoot them. I personally think that if you're transporting a unit of Wraithblades, perhaps, a small unit of Wraithblades to hold an objective for a little bit, or, you're using a unit of Howling Banshees or Harlequins to kind of stage and get into position to either strike out an enemy units or, screen for your more fragile elements in your backfield, this is a good way to use it. But that's not all you're going to do, because the second step of this is you're going to move your Wave Serpent around the left-hand side of the battlefield. There is room for your Wave Serpent to fit through, remember. You don't have to completely go over the wall if you can fit through that crack, and you should be able to on GW terrain setups. Next, you're going to fire and fade to block an enemy unit off. Now, up in the, kind of left center of the battlefield, you will see an enemy land raider or something like that. And of course, land raiders are becoming more popular in competitive play. They are very tough. You do see them in tournaments and you do see them at your local game stores. So we're going to move up our Wave Serpent in a position that land raider now cannot leave its own deployment zone and has to either go around or has to just sit there and shoot at the Wave Serpent. The Wave Serpent probably will die, of course, but the good news is that not only is the Land Raider not moving into a position to secure primary objectives, but that unit of Terminators inside isn't going to be able to do it either. And if you're really lucky, your opponent is going to disembark their Terminators out, assault the Wave Serpent, maybe to get a little extra movement, but you know what? That's going to leave that Terminator unit right out in the open for you to shoot and take out. A smarter opponent might not do that, but your local average Space Marine player at your local game store might look at that scenario and say, you know what, that's too good to pass up. I want to roll some dice and I want to charge that Wave Serpent. And, you let them charge, you let them have that good time killing the Wave Serpent. And then, of course, those Terminators are going to die the very next turn. However, if your opponent doesn't have something like that set up there, you could also always hide the Wave Serpent by putting it on the other side of that ruin. So maybe your opponent doesn't have as many units on that side. If you wanted to use the Wave Serpent later on in the battle, didn't want to sacrifice it right away, you could fire and fade it to that other side, maybe score a secondary objective and, keep it around for a little longer. All right, so the second tactic I want to share with you guys is something called aggressive protection. A lot of times when you're playing a game, your opponent will try to move up, hard-hitting enemy units, things like Eliminators or things like Eradicators behind terrain so that they could, potentially set up on your more fragile units in your backfield. This is a good example of this, right? A unit of Eradicators moves up behind that ruin there in blue, and you notice this, and you notice that his Eradicators are in a position where you probably can't just kill them with your standard shooting. You do need to move aggressively towards that unit. So maybe you move your Wave Serpent up, you disembark the unit inside real quick, and then maybe that unit inside is not going to particularly be able to take out those Eradicators by themselves. So what you're going to do is you're going to move your Wave Serpent up aggressively. You're going to, of course, use your Wave Serpent's ability to fire upon those Eradicators. Now, they could overwatch you, but the good news is that the Wave Serpent has that invul save, right? So the Eradicators with Overwatch probably are not going to be able to one-shot the Wave Serpent, which means you can use your ability on them, and you can also then follow up with a nice tank shock, deal a lot of mortal wounds, potentially cause a battle shock test on them, and then lastly, tie them up in close combat, so they're going to have to fall back if they want to actually shoot, and, they probably won't even be able to do that without some extra CP. Can't exactly remember what detachment allows the Space Marines to fall back and also still shoot. But to be real, I don't think a lot of Space Marine players are running that base detachment anymore. Most of them have moved on to other things. So I don't think you really have to worry about that stratagem all too much. But in any case, you're preventing your opponent from essentially killing your weaker units. Now you'll notice on your home objective is a little small circle. That could be something like a Wraith Lord. That could be something like a Warwalker, right? A more fragile unit that you want to protect. And by using the Wave Serpent in this aggressive manner, you can actually prevent your opponent from being able to target your weaker units and thus foil their plans. And also just make good trades while doing so, because the Wave Serpent, trading a Wave Serpent for a unit of Eradicators is 100% each and every time a win. All right, so the last setup, of course, is the Serpent or Fury. So this is kind of the, Fisher Fury, but the Eldar version of it, which is the superior version, of course. And I actually think the Wave Serpent does this a little bit better just because it's a little bit longer. So it actually gives you more room in between your unit and the enemy unit. And because of those little frills on the hull, I know that some people don't really like counting that as part of the hull, but technically it is part of the model. And, rules as written, it's part of the hull. So that means that it's going to put a little bit more distance between your opponent and your friendly unit. So in this scenario, you move up your Wave Serpent on the right-hand side of the battlefield. You position it in such a way that the enemy units that have, kind of staged on there behind the terrain on the right-hand side of the battlefield can't easily access your unit of Wraithblades or infantry that just sat on the objective. Now, this actually works really well with things like Wraithblades, because usually 5 Wraithblades is strong enough to survive most shooting attacks. What it's not going to be able to do is survive a combined assault of shooting and close combat. So in this scenario, because of the way you place your Wave Serpent in between your Wraithblades and that ruin right there, your opponent is not going to easily be able to both shoot them and assault them in the same turn with the same units in the same area. So what this is most likely going to equal for you, even if the Wave Serpent dies, the Wraithblades and the Wave Serpent together have a lower chance of actually being killed. Especially if you invest Fate Dice and of course things like lightning fast reactions on the Wave Serpent to keep them alive long enough so they score you that primary objective. Now, this can be used aggressively with, units that are a little bit tougher to hold primary objectives, but it can also be used more defensively to put a barrier between your more fragile units and, incoming assault units. So if your opponent is running things like orcs or world bearers, using a Wave Serpent to block an entire charge lane from your opponent is a really good idea and will give you an additional turn of shooting. A single Wave Serpent will be able to buy you a turn by itself, but even if you have multiple Wave Serpents, that can possibly buy you multiple turns of shooting against a very fast combat army like orcs, world bearers, and sometimes even Black Templars and others. So screening with these things can be very useful. And, because you have that ability to battle shock enemy units, that's really good too, because it means that your opponents are not going to be able to target your units, or their units, I should say, with stratagems that can make them more survivable and able to, move faster and stuff like that. And the unit that comes in mind that can actually move faster when you shoot them is, of course, the Khorne Berserkers, who have the Blood Surge ability. If they are battle shocked, however, they cannot use it. Typically, this won't matter because in their turn, or, your turn, they're not going to be battle shocked at the time that you shoot them. But if you have an ability like the Wave Serpents, you can definitely put battle shock on them, and then they won't be able to get that extra movement. Which again is very powerful, and if you can prevent it, you should. And not that it's a guarantee, because of course they do have a pretty high leadership value, but they could always fail, rolling a 5, rolling a 4, 3, 2, those will all fail your battle shock. So there is a decent chance that they will fail once in a while, especially if you have multiple Wave Serpents blocking them off. Okay, so what is the role of the Wave Serpent in an Eldar army, and how do you make the most out of it? So the Wave Serpent is a fast transport that excels in disruption and movement prevention. The combination of its speed alongside its elongated hull, allowing it to prevent opponents from getting where they need to. There's also always the chance at a failed battle shock test, meaning the units cannot use stratagems and of course benefit from certain abilities. So even though the Wave Serpent at first seems like attacks, it does so much more than just get your units where they need to go and protect them from things like indirect fire. It acts as a very big disruption tool that can not only cause a lot of mortals and finish things off via tank shock or, via its ability, but it can also physically prevent your opponent from getting to objectives early, and that can really give you a major advantage in control of the board. So don't underestimate the Wave Serpent. Honestly, it is a very humble vehicle, but it can do a lot for you on the battlefield if you're clever with it. So in conclusion, as more armies are gaining access to things like 3-inch deep strike and more defensive stratagems, transports like the Wave Serpent are going to be looked at more closely in the coming months, and I guarantee you will see more Wave Serpents appear in lists every once in a while. And believe it or not, I actually have a feeling that we will be seeing the return of more Wave Serpents in the coming months. In fact, I actually think that Mechdar might be one of the lists and archetypes to watch in the coming months as far as the way that the Eldar evolve to the coming threats, right? We're going to have Tau coming up. They're going to be very much mobile, right? They're going to have a lot of battle suits, a lot of deep striking. They're going to have a lot of screening units and stuff like that. They can pretty easily mess with our aspect warriors, things like Kroot Hounds. They have indirect fire via their smart missile systems. They're going to have a lot of tools to deal with Eldar, and I think Wave Serpents are one of the more obvious answers to that threat. And I think as well, Necrons, even after they're nerfed, still have a huge amount of mobility, being able to battle shock enemy units, like the Monolith, for example, and prevent them from actually being able to use their 4-up invul strat on that big target is huge, right? That's the difference between winning a game right there and losing a game by one failed battle shock. And guess what, guys? The Necron Monolith, the leadership isn't great. So, it's not rocking a 5 leadership or anything like that. So that thing fails its battle shock test, open season for your anti-large. And again, the great thing about the Wave Serpent ability is it's not a shooting attack, so your opponent cannot preemptively just use their stratagems when you target them, unlike the Void Weaver and things like the Wraithseer, which is awesome. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching once again, and let me know what you guys think about Wave Serpents in the comments section below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on it. Thank you so much to all my Patreons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last month. Your help has greatly improved the channel and helped it grow significantly. If you do want to help support the channel, I have free trials activated on my Patreon, which will grant you permanent access to our Discord community, which is a community of Eldar players and enthusiasts who love talking about strategy, tactics, and of course, hobbying. I will leave the link for that in the description below. I'm also an Amazon affiliate and have a channel store page, so if you want to grab some discounted Eldar miniatures on Amazon, or you want to grab some Eldar-inspired apparel to rep your local game store on the channel store page, I will leave the links for those in the description as well. All right, everybody, that is going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching once again, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.